Resolving to conceal my existence from as many people as possible, it was determined by Zintral's government that the facility in which I had woken up, known by them as Toramna Chirk, or Steel Nest in English, would become my home for the foreseeable future. Fortunately, this base already possessed a thriving R&D department, requiring little in the way of renovations to become a new covert capital of technological advancement. Chot's words, not mine. Within just a few days of inviting them, brilliant minds from all across the country flocked to this facility to partake in the secret project. All participants were required to sign an oath of secrecy before even being allowed inside, and those already here were made to undergo a similar process. Reading one of the papers myself, with significant assistance from Vavi, I noted with interest the isolation clause listed therein. Nobody who signed such documents would be allowed to leave these premises until the war's end, and doing so would be prosecuted as treason. Initially, I had predicted that this not-so-fine print would be a major deal-breaker for most of our invitees. However, out of the 23 scientists who'd been invited, only one of them wasn't listed as present on the clipboard I'd been provided. Then again, given how desperate things were on the war front, I suppose it was understandable that they'd jump at any chance to help turn the tides. Perhaps the most complicated issue on display here was that of my own introduction. Vavi and the other scientists worked in tandem with Chot's diplomatic team to draft and script an entrance for me. Too sudden of an introduction might overwhelm them, Holven told me, but with Zintral embattled in a war of genocide, every day spent preparing them would invite from the enemy unacceptable losses. In the end, a serviceable balance was finally struck in the form of a 3-stop guided tour. First, upon entering the facility and making their way down to the labs, scientists were presented with a variety of blueprints drawn by yours truly. Though I specialized in the aerospace field, mechanical engineering of all sorts was well within my wheelhouse. Diagrams of functional fission reactors, Earth-standard combat jets, and advanced missile systems all featured within this display. As for the technologies I wasn't entirely sure of, my ship's computer contained its own miniature search engine for all things STEM, another artifact left for me by my now long-dead friends back on Earth. This allowed me to include things like penicillin and basic vaccine technology. To the Kafel people, these blueprints and texts alone were a technological treasure trove. However, as I told Chot to inform them, they were just the beginning. The next stop on their trip was meant to answer the obvious question of where did you get all this? Attendees were shown the pod in which I'd arrived, then organized into groups to take turns checking out its interior, equipped with several security cameras, though which I was able to observe their individual reactions to the display. Most of the scientists were visibly itching for the chance to pick it apart and see how it all worked, and their excited chatter regarded not only the future uses of this tech, but also its implications for the existence of alien life. Finally, after finishing their investigation of the ship, guests were brought down into the main lab where I anxiously awaited their arrival. "Hello there," I waved politely, stepping into view from around the other side of a truck-sized computer to greet them once they were all past the entrance threshold. By my side, one of Chot's ambassadors quickly translated what I had just said into their language. "My name is Andrew. I'm the one whose ship you guys were just poking around in." Most of the scientists didn't know how to respond, simply staring at me in a mixture of pure confusion, awe, and even some fear. One of them appeared to be on the verge of losing consciousness, but was fortunately able to remain amongst us for the time being. Once the initial shock of our guests finally died down, Vavi, who had been serving as a guide throughout their tour, began chirping out the speech she'd prepared and practiced for them. Though I didn't yet entirely understand their language, so many times had we rehearsed this particular moment that I could recite the translation by heart. As you all know, on the 22nd Esthria of this year, mere days ago, an unidentified flying object reportedly crashed on the Souk family farm. This artifact, as it turns out, was an extraterrestrial transport vehicle. That cryogenic bay you saw inside the pod was meant to preserve its passenger during the flight. Inside of it, we found what we thought to be the corpse of an alien life form. As it turned out, this ship's sole crew member, named Andrew Malix, was very much alive. Andrew here stands before you as a member of the human species, inhabitants of Earth, the third planet surrounding their home star. He has heard our plight and now wishes to aid us in our efforts to dismantle Providence's burgeoning ethno-state. With the technological advances he has offered to teach us, we may just be able to push back against them and end the Climac War once and for all. Stepping forth to position myself beside Vavi and greeting the bewildered strangers with a bow, I carefully articulated in their language one of the boilerplate lines I myself had rehearsed. Frifina, halvakti torkratrit. Translation, do you have any questions before we get into this? For the longest time, not a single one of the scientists moved a muscle, besides the previously lightheaded one, who by now had truly fainted. Finally, the silence was broken when one of the researchers raised her arm to be called upon. Offering this kafel a short go-ahead, I listened carefully as my attendant translated her question. "Why did you really come here?" she asked, her tail lashing erratically from side to side to indicate suspicion. What kind of stake could a technologically advanced alien civilization possibly have in this conflict? What's in this for you? That's a fair question, I shrugged, awkwardly rubbing at the still-healing chest scars obtained through Holvin's accidental vivisection. If I'm to be honest with you all, I wasn't even really supposed to be here. In fact, my ship was actually bound for an entirely different system until its thrusters failed, preventing course corrections and as a result sending me wildly off-route. This explanation was evidently not what any of these scientists had expected. In fact, even Vavi seemed a tad taken aback by such an answer. If that's the case, my interrogator continued, then why help us at all? In all honesty, I didn't have much in the way of a response to that particular inquiry. In fact, the only thing close to such a reply was only 4 words long. So, with nothing better to respond with and no time for searching, I opened my mouth and reluctantly allowed the short yet staunch explanation to greet my new coworkers. Because I want to! Once their initial suspicions were dispelled, the Kafel scientists quickly opened up to my presence with questions upon questions regarding human culture, history, and, most of all, our knowledge. "How did you make your computers so efficient?" one of the researchers asked in his native language, gesturing to the massive Kafel-designed computer central to this room as my Kafel translator repeated the words in my own tongue. "Our own devices are orders of magnitude larger, and yet their power pales in comparison." Sifting through what little I remembered of this topic from my engineering college, I carefully composed my reply. Vacuum tubes were a major limiting factor in our early computers. They're good for some applications, but by and large, we switched to transistors. There are blueprints for them over with the rest. "Mr. Malix," another of the scientists began, calling out to me in pre-rehearsed English before proceeding in, let's just call it Zintrish. "We're all very curious about your ship. Would you perhaps be amenable to letting us take a pluck? If you mean dismantling it." I shrugged carelessly, regarding the group with manufactured nonchalance. "Go ahead and do what you want with its hull and cryo bay, but be careful with the engine. That thing's got a temper." Further considering the necessity of my ship tech, I continued. "I don't think you should take apart the main computer just yet. I still might need that. However, my personal laptop is pretty much free to do as you please with. Just let me download a few files onto the main computer and it's good as yours." The scientists chirped with rapturous excitement upon my response. To me, this seemed like a pretty simple issue. It wasn't like I would be going home anytime soon, and if I did, what would there even be for me back there? Even if the Kafel somehow managed to build a 0.99c, basically the speed of light vehicle within a few years, by the time I arrived at Earth, it still wouldn't be the planet I remember, not after nearly 300 years of change. Would anyone even remember me back there? Or would I just be some kind of obscure trivia blurb? Would I even get that? Once again, the computer engineer piped up with another question. "How powerful is your personal computer?" he asked, near suspiciously. "Given what I understand about our early computers," I began, taking no small amount of pride and joy in the undivided attention of fellow scientists. "I'd say a good million times at least." Questions continued in this vein for a while, with me going over some more specifics of advanced human technology. Surprisingly, it was the military techs who were most interested in the idea of an internet, and the idea of using specialized viruses to modify a genome left the resident geneticist buzzing with excitement. That being said, my favorite inquiries were probably the ones relating to human culture and history. "What sort of government do your people practice?" asked one of the ambassadors, an exceptionally short male Kafel only about an inch taller than me. "Last I checked, most free nations on Earth operate as democratic republics. What about you guys?" Preening himself proudly, the ambassador replied, "We use a form of direct democracy. It's more difficult to manage than our allies' republics, but also allows for less corruption." "For how long have your people been spacefaring?" one of the aerospace experts asked, holding a pen to their clipboard as though to take notes. "Depends," I shrugged. "If you judge it by extraplanetary colonies, then only about 250 years. However, if you go by when our people first set foot on another world, our moon, then it's a little over 400. My translator's throat clicked curiously as he mulled over the conversion rates of Earth years to their own. I knew by the audible gasp when he had finally figured them out. Reporting these numbers to the other attendants garnered similar reactions. "Your kind are over 400 years ahead of us in technological advancement," whistled the computer scientist. "I am deeply curious as to what you've achieved in that time." "You and me both, pal," I chuckled wryly, making note of his obvious confusion before continuing on in hopes to address it. "I've been in the icebox for almost half of that, and SHIP's database is still missing the most recent 100 or so years. That being said, I've still got plenty of information to share." Next to speak up in this conversation was an energy engineer. The feathers of her crest possessed an array of bright blues and oranges, presumably some form of artificial ornamentation. "We found 2 dislodged canisters of antimatter on your ship. How did your people manage to make that?" This question was definitely outside of my expertise. I knew a few things about antimatter as an energy source, but in terms of its actual mechanics, I was rather clueless. "I'll check my ship's computer for that one later. For now, please be careful with those. They're specifically designed not to rupture, but if they do, the explosion will make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker." "Hydrogen bomb, you say?" interjected one of the military techs, predictably perking up upon mention of a bomb. "What's that?" Well, shit. I hadn't intended to tell them about those for at least a little while, not unless the situation got truly desperate. Unfortunately, my fat fucking mouth had other plans. "It's an explosive that can level entire cities, a last resort," I stated, carefully gauging their myriad responses. "Fascinating," the military tech nodded. "Such destructive capabilities are utterly unheard of to our species." Meanwhile, amongst every other Kafel in that room, the overwhelming consensus appeared to be one of abject terror. And who could blame them? I had just introduced these aliens to the concept of a city-scale WMD. What happened on your planet to necessitate the creation of such a weapon?" asked the energy engineer, utterly stunned by the prospect. "Our Second World War wasn't a pretty affair," I shrugged in reply, prompting several looks of surprise from the Kafel upon my mention of 2 global wars. "Let's just hope this one doesn't come down to that." "I hope so," affirmed Vavi, having at some point managed, in spite of my perception, to sneak up beside me. "Huh, Andrew," she began, stumbling over what had previously been misinterpreted as my name. "What are your people like?" The question took me by surprise. How was I supposed to summarize my entire species? How can one give definition to a people defined by contradictions? I wouldn't call us warlike. Violence and bloodshed had to be justified by leaders, legitimately or not, to get their people on board. Then again, we certainly weren't peaceful either. Since the conception of civilization, compassion and greed have remained ever at war for the heart of mankind. Our simultaneous yearning for and fear of the unknown has inspired all sorts of media from Star Trek to Alien. In the end, none of terms could truly describe how humanity as a whole behaved. For a brief moment, I considered defining us in terms of biology and evolution. Even in that field, however, our understanding of how we rock-throwing primates came to be was comically limited. However, it was in the midst of my sifting through hypotheses on human hunting methods that the correct term finally found me. "Persistent," I uttered dryly, allowing the translated word to sink in before continuing. My species practically exists in the bounds of a single question. How far can we go? The nation I hail from reached the stars because we wanted to beat the Soviets. The nation of China started our people's first lunar colony to beat the United States, who then caught up and built Olif, an entire city on the dry, dead planet of Mars. Giving up isn't really in our blood. The Kafel listened intently as I spoke, pleasing the performance portion of my brain with how they hung on every word. And for that, we are grateful, the military tech nodded, offering up to me a deferential bow. With your help, we can turn this war around and take back our allied cities from those pluck-feather bastards. Before we begin, I began, proudly straightening myself and tugging dramatically upon the flaps of my lab coat. I have a question for all of you. The room fell silent with dramatic anticipation as the techs anxiously awaited my inquiry. What I want to know? I started, glancing all about, frankly unnecessarily, to ensure the attention of my new colleagues. Is where do we start? Cheers sounded out around me as immediately the individual department heads began discussing amongst themselves the division of my time. So caught up had I been in this fantastical situation that I hadn't even noticed the janitor hanging around with us in the lab. Another thing I didn't pay much mind to was the pair of blueprints that by the meeting's end weren't accounted for.